When I was growing up, we had an apple tree in our backyard. I had a love-hate relationship with this apple tree. I thought it was cool that we had apples in our backyard. That was fun. And I remember seeing a big cider press on Sesame Street one time, and I really wanted a cider press. And I pushed my parents for a cider press, but we never filled our garage with a big cider press, which is too bad. And part of the reason I wanted a cider press is because my job was picking the apples up off the ground. That was one of my chores, because we had to pick them up before my dad mowed the grass and started firing them across the neighborhood. So we had to pick them up. And our apple tree had never been pruned. It wasn't really cared for. It was there before we moved to the house. And so it produced these little bitty apples, lots of little bitty apples, and they had scabs and worms in them, and they weren't good for eating. And so by the end of the summer and the fall, every single one of those apples I picked up in a 5-gallon bucket, and they were rotten and rotting and smelly, fermenting, wormy apples. I didn't like it. So we cut the tree down, and then much later I learned about pruning. Like, oh, we should have pruned that apple tree. If we could have cleared out the clutter of those branches and just left a few of the branches, then the apple tree would have been able to put more energy into making a few fruit that would be bigger and better and good for eating. And I wouldn't have had to pick so many up off the ground. That's the power of pruning. Well, today's passage from John gives us one of those famous I am statements of Jesus. I am the vine, you are the branches. Last week we were talking about Jesus as Jesus saying, I am the good shepherd. He also says, I am the way, the truth, and the life. Now the vine and the branches is a beautiful image, very important one for the life of the church. And I thought I'd be focusing on that today. But as I read it this week, I found myself focusing on those passages, or the verses on pruning. The beginning of chapter 15 starts out like this. I am the true vine, and my Father is the vine grower. He removes every branch in me that bears no fruit. And every branch that bears fruit, he prunes to make it bear more fruit. The Gospel of John's talking about the church here. Jesus is talking to us. The last 2 weeks of April, I've attended 2 wider church gatherings that I've been thinking about a lot. The first event was a meeting of the clergy of the Wisconsin Conference of the UCC, and it was held in Stevens Point. Now, because of lower giving, the conference is proposing, or the board of directors is proposing cutting staff. We just can't afford the staff that we've had in the past. So the proposal is that we cut from 4 association ministers to 2 association ministers. And the meeting was designed to bring the clergy together to talk about this. And as we gathered, we were given some context for our discussion in the form of some important statistics that I'd like to share with you. So, 40 years ago, the United Church of Christ had just over 2 million members. Now we have just over 1 million members. So our membership as a church has cut about in half. In the same amount of time, 40 years ago, we had just over 6,000 congregations. Now we have just over 5,000 congregations. So while our membership has been cut in half, we haven't lost half of our congregations. We just have more and more churches with fewer and fewer people in them, which makes sense. Now, any guesses on the average age of clergy in the United Church of Christ? Let's do this Price of Right style. So just shout a number out at me. Any guess of the average age of clergy in the United Church of Christ? 55. That's too low. Too low. Higher. 60. Too high. Come down a little bit. 62. It's 60. Okay, so the average age of clergy in the UCC is 60. Now, our second guess'em game is how many clergy under the age of 35, so people in my category, under the age of 35 are there in the United Church of Christ. Remember that we have 5,000 congregations as a church. Any guesses? How many? 12. Too low. How many? Way too high. Come down. 100. Close. Little low. 135 is our number. So that's 3.4% of clergy are under the age of 35. 135 clergy, 5,000, under 35, 5,000 congregations. So what this means is that in 10 years, when all the clergy who are 60 are 70, retired or wanting to retire, we're not going to have many clergy ready to step into their shoes. Now, we do have second career people who are coming into ordained ministry, but we don't have enough to close that gap. Now this is happening in other denominations too. Mainline churches are all in the same boat. The Catholics are rowing right next to us. Evangelicals, as strong as they are floating along in a boat that has some cracks in it and is taking on some water too. Now at this gathering of clergy, the generational differences in that room were on display for everyone to see, at least in my view. Most of the group was very concerned about how this proposal was going to work. They were saying things like, too much that's important is going to be left out. Relationships among the churches and the associations are going to suffer. Churches need more support individually than this new structure will be able to provide. How are you going to do all of this? We are all sitting around at various tables, and if the average age is 60 of clergy in the UCC, I was sitting at a below average table. I felt like our conversation was good, but our age was below average. There were 3 of us that were in their 30s, a couple in their late 40s, early 50s, and one that was 60. And we all reported to the group, and I was the reporter for our table. And I reported that our table thought that this proposal didn't go far enough. We encouraged the board of directors to do more with this proposal. Now, there were some very good and very innovative ideas, we thought, of how we need to do things differently as a conference with this proposal. But we felt like the proposal was still trying to bring everything in the associations, everything in the conference with us, that we weren't willing to let go of anything. And our group was saying we have to let some things go. And as I was reporting this to the group, there were people shaking their heads at me. You silly boy, they were saying inside their heads. Last week, I went to a retreat for UCC clergy in their 20s and 30s for the Midwest. So there were 15 of us gathered from Minnesota, Iowa, all the way to Pennsylvania. We had a great group of talented people there. And as we talked through the week, though our conversation was interesting, there was something in particular that was interesting. As a group, we don't remember the glory days of the church. We just don't remember them. We don't remember when the church or the choir loft was full. We don't remember when Sunday school was bursting at the seams. We don't remember when there were lots and lots of volunteers for anything you wanted to do. We don't remember that at all. In our experience, the church has always been struggling to do this, struggling to keep doing that. So we just don't have that frame of reference that most everyone in the congregation, in our congregations, have. And when we look at the wider church and the local church to a person in that group, what we see are systems and activities that may have worked really well in 1960 and 1970, but just aren't a good fit in 2009. We talked about that a lot in all of our churches. Now, this isn't a unique thing to the church. This is happening everywhere in our culture with our institutions. You see it with General Motors, for instance. They had a great business plan for 1960 and 1970. It was kind of hanging on in 1980 and the 90s. And in the 2000, when they needed to become more nimble, they started having trouble. And there are other institutions like that. And our church is also one of those institutions. And as I read the text for today from John, I couldn't help but think, sounds like God is doing some pruning. Sometimes numbers lie, but I don't think the statistics I shared earlier do. In the next 10 years, when all 60-year-old clergy are 70, there's going to be a shortage of clergy. Now, we can either see this as a disaster for the church, or we can see it as a great opportunity for the church. Now, it may sound a bit ironic for a clergy person to be standing up here saying, boy, thank goodness we're getting rid of all those clergy so the church can finally be vital and alive. But I think there's opportunity here, an opportunity for us to share more equally the vital and important ministry of the life of the church. We are connected to the vine, after all. This is saying that God is with us. And their scriptures proclaim over and over, God is with the people of Israel as they were in the midst of their struggles. God is with the church, the early church, as they were facing persecutions. God is with us now as we face much less critical circumstances. God's probably just waiting around, tapping the divine watch, saying, come on, people, honking the horn. Come on, let's go already. We've got work to do. We now have the opportunity to ask important questions. What's our purpose as a church?